Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into the intricate world of operational risks and regulatory compliance, specifically for you banking risk managers out there. Our source material is a pretty comprehensive supervisory guide. It's packed with details on how bank should manage their internal models. The sophisticated frameworks used for everything from credit exposure to market risk calculations. Our mission today, to cut through that complexity, we want to pull out the most vital insights, the actionable knowledge from these regulatory expectations. Think of it as your shortcut, really, to understanding what truly matters in managing these models, whether they're for credit, market, or counterparty credit risk.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how these guidelines really aim to fortify the soundness, the integrity of banks' internal frameworks, which is obviously even more critical as, financial instruments get more complex and modeling techniques keep evolving. So we'll be connecting the dots, basically, between those high-level principles and some very specific operational requirements. It's also important to remember, as you said, the guide itself isn't static. It's evolved, through public consultations, regulatory changes. The latest versions reflect updates right up to 2023. So yeah, it's a living document. It reflects this ongoing commitment to robust risk management.
That's a great point about evolution. A living document. Okay, so let's start with those crucial overarching principles for the internal models. What's the core expectation for institutions regarding their models, particularly in terms of risk management?
Well, the fundamental expectation really is to have a truly robust model risk management framework. And that applies to all models an institution uses, not just, say, a select few approved for capital calculation. This framework needs to stand on several key pillars: clear model governance, a strong risk control function, an independent validation function, and a well-defined internal audit process. And all of this has got to be supported by thoroughly documented policies. It sounds like a lot, and it is. Beyond those pillars, institutions also need things like a comprehensive register of all their internal models, for that holistic view, plus clear procedures for communicating and reporting model risks and precisely defined roles and responsibilities. For everyone involved, right up to senior management, the message is pretty clear: no model operates in a vacuum.
That word independence really jumps out. It seems absolutely critical, particularly for that validation function. How does the guide elaborate on ensuring that independence, especially given how complex these models can get?
Right, that's where the rubber meets the road, isn't it? To ensure effective independence, institutions need appropriate organizational arrangements. The key is that the internal validation function has to be genuinely separate from the model development process. And that covers everything: design, implementation, ongoing monitoring, the whole life cycle. The guide outlines a few ways to do this. The most robust setup, having 2 different units reporting to different members of senior management. Now, it does allow for validation and development units to report to the same senior manager, but it explicitly says this offers, decreasing robustness. What's crucial, though, whatever the structure, is that the validation function must be adequately staffed. And that means suitable resources, experienced, qualified personnel. It's not just about headcount, it's about having that deep quantitative and qualitative knowledge, enough to provide an effective, independent challenge to the models, really scrutinizing their assumptions, their performance.
I'm curious, institutions are increasingly using advanced techniques. How does this guide address the modeling challenges that come from, say, machine learning, ML? We know that's a huge topic right now.
Oh, absolutely. It's an essential area, and the guide explicitly tackles it. It treats the use of ML in internal models as an overarching topic. It's generally applicable to all internal models used for Pillar 1 purposes. Pillar 1 being, the calculation of minimum capital requirements for the main risks. So ML principles apply right across credit, market, and counterparty credit risk models. The guide acknowledges that ML increases a model's complexity that's influenced by its mathematical methodology, the often vast databases it uses, and, how central ML actually is to the model's function. And this brings specific expectations, for instance, around managing model changes for ML-based models and rigorous validation activities. They really emphasize checking for stability, robustness, and crucially, out-of-sample and out-of-time performance. You need to be sure the model isn't just sort of memorizing past data, but can actually generalize. A really important point is the critical need for explainability techniques and tools. This helps support the plausibility, the intuitiveness of the risk estimates. We need to understand why the model is making a certain prediction, right? And finally, internal audit needs to specifically assess the unique characteristics of ML techniques, ensuring auditability, traceability, allowing decisions to be replicated and verified.
That makes a lot of sense. What about outsourcing? Outsourcing some of these functions like validation or audit. That seems fairly common in the industry, bringing in external expertise.
Yeah, it is. But if tasks like internal validation or internal audit are delegated to a third party, the ultimate responsibility, it always remains with the outsourcing institution. Always. This lines up with broader regulatory guidelines on outsourcing, too. The guide really stresses that the content, quality, and governance of these outsourced activities must be consistent with what you'd expect if they were done internally. For example, reports should carry both logos, the institutions and the third parties, and they need senior management approval. And critically, even when you delegate development or maintenance, you must maintain an appropriate level of in-house knowledge. You can't just hand it off completely. You need to keep that expertise to understand and, importantly, challenge the work being done.
Okay, now that we've laid out those sort of foundational principles for internal models, let's apply this lens to specific risk types, maybe starting with credit risk, and particularly the IRB approach. For risk managers using this internal ratings-based approach, what are the most significant areas the guide emphasizes?
Right. For the IRB approach, the guide focuses heavily on ensuring transparency and robust governance. This includes very detailed provisions on things like the rollout and permanent partial use, or PPU, of IRB. You need supervisory permission for any significant changes, or even for reverting back to less sophisticated approaches. A big chunk of the guide is dedicated to the corporate governance functions related to IRB. And crucially, it emphasizes the materiality of rating systems.
Materiality of rating systems. Okay, that sounds like a core concept. How is that specifically defined, and why is it so important?
Yeah, it's absolutely central. Materiality isn't just, an abstract idea. It directly impacts the level of supervisory scrutiny. It's determined by both quantitative criteria, things like the share of total exposure at default, EAD, and risk-weight exposure amounts, RWEA, covered by a system, and also qualitative criteria, like the type, riskiness, strategic importance of the exposures, the complexity of the rating systems themselves, and the inherent model risk. Basically, the more material a system is, the tougher the requirements and the higher the scrutiny. And the management body, senior management, they have a direct, non-delegable responsibility here. They have to approve all material aspects of the rating and estimation processes, and they're accountable for the quality and timeliness of all applications and notifications. It really pushes model oversight right to the top.
And the Credit Risk Control Unit, the CRCU, how does the guide define its role and, again, ensure its independence within this framework?
Yes, the CRCU. A critical player. It absolutely needs to be independent from the people and management functions responsible for originating and renewing exposures. That separation of duties is just fundamental to preventing conflicts of interest. Their roles, their responsibilities, must be clearly documented, and they need a direct line of reporting straight to senior management. This helps ensure they can provide unbiased oversight and challenge without, being swayed by commercial pressures.
The guide goes into a lot of detail on how these models are reviewed and validated. Can you walk us through some of the core expectations there, especially around ongoing monitoring and the validation cycle?
Absolutely. So risk estimates, think PD, LGD, they need to be reviewed at least annually, or of course, whenever significant new information comes to light. This involves both ongoing monitoring by the CRCU, kind of a continuous check, and then a more formal annual validation by that independent validation function we talked about. That internal validation needs to ensure accuracy, consistency, through regular assessment. And for those really material rating systems, a full validation is required at least once every 3 years. Now, this isn't just ticking boxes, it's a deep dive. It involves rigorous back testing, comparing your estimates with what actually happened, the realized default rates, plus analysis of discriminatory power, representativeness of your data, stability analyses of ratings over time. It's thorough. And the internal audit function plays a vital role, too. They conduct a general risk assessment to draw up their work plan, and they're expected to recommend additional audits outside the annual plan, particularly for highly complex or dynamic models, like ML-based ones, or any areas showing signs of increased risk.
Okay, that brings us to the use test requirement and also how human judgment factors in, because we know models aren't always perfect, right?
Exactly. The use test is critical because it basically dictates that the internal ratings and the default and loss estimates must be significantly integrated into the bank's risk management and decision-making. It's not just about compliance reporting, it's about embedding these models into credit approval, internal capital allocation, corporate governance, pricing, even early warning systems. This makes sure the models are actually driving decisions, not just sitting on a shelf producing numbers. Now, on human judgment, the guide explicitly addresses overrides. These are those judgment-based discretionary actions that adjust model outputs. Institutions have to meticulously document the situations where judgment can override the model, and who's responsible for approving these overrides. Policies should also clearly define the maximum extent of overrides, maybe a maximum number of rating notches up, or a maximum percentage of overridden exposures. And crucially, if these overrides don't consistently increase the model's accuracy over time, the override policy itself needs to be reviewed, maybe even tightened. The guide also highlights managing things like non-rated exposures and outdated ratings. You need specific policies to identify and monitor their materiality to ensure, proper prudential treatment.
Data management and IT systems also get a lot of attention, which makes sense given the sheer volume of data in banking. How critical are they to this whole framework?
They're absolutely foundational. Without high-quality data and robust systems, even the best models are, compromised from the start. Institutions must deploy well-documented, adequately tested IT systems and couple that with sound data management practices. This covers the entire model's data flow right from data entry through to final reporting, and it mandates a comprehensive data quality management framework with clear policies, clear procedures. This framework needs to define data quality standards covering dimensions like completeness, accuracy, consistency, timeliness, uniqueness, validity, availability, traceability, all the key aspects. It also requires systematic metrics to actually assess compliance with these standards. And formal data quality reporting is expected. It needs to go up to senior management and the management body. The message is crystal clear. Data is the lifeblood of these models. Its integrity is paramount.
And the definition of default. The guide seems quite granular there, probably because it's so fundamental to credit risk itself.
It is. It's an absolutely core concept directly impacting risk quantification. The guide elaborates on Article 110(a)(1) of the CRR, the Capital Requirements Regulation. It defines default by either a materiality threshold being exceeded or unlikeliness to pay. And it's quite specific. For example, the 91st consecutive day past due automatically triggers a default. No wiggle room there. It explicitly says proxies like month is in arrears just aren't permitted for that definition. It also provides detailed guidance on how things like distress restructuring impact default status and outlines the probation periods required before an exposure can return to non-defaulted status. There are even precise instructions on how to make adjustments to your risk estimates if the definition of default itself changes. It really shows the level of detail expected.
Okay, finally for credit risk, what about estimating those core parameters? PD, LGD, and CCF. Probability of default, loss given default, credit conversion factor.
Right. The guide delves into the use of data, whether it's internal, external, or pooled data for estimating these parameters. For probability of default, or PD, it covers calculating the one-year default rate and observed average default rates over time. This requires ensuring your historical data is representative, analyzing economic indicators, and classifying bad or good economic years over a long period, typically a 20-year window to capture at least 2 full economic cycles. It also addresses things like systematic deviations at the rating grade level. For loss given default, LGD, it covers realized LGD calculation, how to handle incomplete recovery processes, and the treatment of collateral repossession, which requires applying conservative haircuts to collateral value. And it explicitly stresses that institutions are not expected to cap realized LGD values. Actual losses should be fully reflected even if they exceed 100%. Conversion factors, CCFs, are discussed mainly for undrawn revolving commitments, with details on calculating realized CCFs and thinking about appropriate aggregation levels. And throughout all of this, the guide emphasizes the constant review of all these estimates. Whenever new info arises, but at least annually. Assessing risk differentiation capability, the impact of human judgments, is an ongoing process.
Let's shift gears now. Let's move to market risk. The guide references CR2 and CR3, so clearly there have been updates reflecting regulatory evolution. What's central here for risk managers using internal models for market risk?
Yeah, the market risk section reflects those significant updates. The primary focus is on the internal model approach, the IMA, used for calculating own funds requirements for market risk. Specifically, this covers value at risk, or VAIR models, stressed fair SVAR methodologies, and the incremental default and migration risk charge, the IRC methodology. A really key aspect here is the strict delimitation of the regulatory trading book. This precisely defines what positions are included or excluded from the IMA scope. We're talking complex items like hedges, CVA hedges, back-to-back transactions, securities lending, reverse repos, banking book FX positions, own debt positions, defaulted debt, a whole range. And importantly, any exclusions must be thoroughly justified, and not just for the purpose of reducing capital requirements. That's a clear signal about wanting clarity and consistency.
Backtesting. That's always a major requirement for market risk models. What does the guide highlight about it? Especially, what happens when models miss the mark?
Backtesting. Yes, regulatory backtesting of VOR models is absolutely crucial. It involves comparing hypothetical and actual profit and loss P&L with the VAR numbers over the most recent 250 business days. The guide even defines things like local and global business days for consistent P&L calculation. Now, for every regulatory backtesting overshooting, that's when your actual loss exceeds the VAR estimate, a detailed analysis has to be performed. And it needs to be provided to the competent authority within 1 month. Quick turnaround. This analysis has to be comprehensive, covering portfolio analysis, what were the main loss contributors, market analysis, what changed in risk factors, correlations, and a direct analysis of the internal model itself. Why did it miss? And beyond the regulatory requirement, internal backtesting is also required at more granular levels, not just top of the house, to really test the integrity of the VAR measure across the whole portfolio. It's about constant vigilance, really.
And what about the actual VAR and stressed VAR methodologies themselves? What are the key expectations there?
Well, institutions have to demonstrate the appropriateness of any assumptions made within their internal models, ensuring reasonably accurate risk measurement. This includes, for example, making sure the number of simulations you use for Monte Carlo approaches is actually sufficient for stable VAR and VAR outputs. Specific attention is given to the choice of the historical observation period, how you handle missing data, which generally you shouldn't do unless the data is clearly faulty or stale, and the use of proxies. Proxies must be appropriately conservative and really only used where available data are genuinely insufficient. The guide also scrutinizes the pricing functions and methods used within the VAR and SVAR models. They need validation against the ones used for economic P&L, your front office pricing, to ensure consistency.
Okay, tell us about the IRC models, specifically those focusing on default risk.
Right, the incremental default and migration risk charge models. There are detailed requirements here on things like portfolio representativeness for the calculations, data quality with quarterly checks expected, and the underlying distribution and correlation assumptions. A key expectation is performing sensitivity analyses for IRC and default risk. This means systematically shifting things like risk factor weights or correlations up or down to really understand the model's robustness under different scenarios. How sensitive is it? The guide provides some best practice maximum recovery rates, RRs, for different debt types, like 25% for subordinated debt, 55% for senior unsecured, 88.75% for covered bonds, 75% for other stuff. Importantly, if a bank wants to use higher RRs than these benchmarks, they need to provide objective, up-to-date data to justify it. It also covers things like PD fallback values when you don't have enough data, and ensuring consistency requirements across different risk measures.
And then there's this fascinating concept of risks not in the model engines, or RNID. This sounds like, well, an effort to capture what might fall through the cracks.
It is precisely that. RNAME. Risks that are not captured adequately or maybe completely omitted from the primary risk engines. They can pop up from various sources, maybe differences in positions, risk factors, pricing methods between the model and the actual end-of-day valuation, or maybe weaknesses and limitations in how you stochastically model the risk factors themselves. So the guide requires a robust framework for identifying, quantifying, and managing these RNME with regular impact quantification and monitoring. Now, crucially, if an individual RMA is considered substantial, and substantial means its quantified impact is more than 5% of the amount computed by the main risk engine, then it must be included in the total risk exposure amount via an RME add-on. This add-on is then multiplied by 12.5, the standard capital multiplier, and must be updated at least quarterly. A key principle here: no diversification effect allowed between different RME add-ons. You can't net them against each other, and any change to the RME framework itself, that constitutes an IMME model change and requires prior notification to the competent authorities. This really underscores the regulator's drive for truly comprehensive risk capture, making sure even those missing risks are accounted for in capital.
Okay, finally, let's touch on counterparty credit risk, CCR. What are the key areas for risk managers here, especially concerning the internal model method, the IMM?
Right. For CCR, the guide emphasizes the internal model method, or IMM, that's used to calculate the exposure value for derivatives and securities financing transactions, SFTs. It particularly stresses the importance of identifying significant pricing model deficiencies right down at the transaction level, and then, of course, taking appropriate measures to address any identified model weaknesses.
How are these exposure values determined? Especially when collateral is involved, which can add another layer of complexity, right?
Definitely. The margin period of risk, or MPR, is a critical element here. Institutions have to determine if collateral is illiquid or if maybe over-the-counter OTC derivatives can't be easily replaced under stressed market conditions, because that might extend the minimum MPR, potentially up to 20 business days, which effectively increases the risk window and the exposure value. Assessing this involves looking at factors like daily trading volume, how long it's been since the last market price was observed, the issuer's financial health, things like that. Collateral modeling itself needs strong model integrity. Ideally, you model the collateral jointly with the exposure, not as a separate disconnected process. Policies also need to define the expected future composition of the collateral pool. There's also specific attention on initial margin, or IM, modeling, making sure it adequately reflects the contractual arrangements and the risk mitigation it provides.
And the effective expected positive exposure, EEP, how does that fit in?
EEPE. The calculation is linked to the supervisory alpha factor. And that alpha factor, typically 1.4, can be increased by regulators specifically to address model deficiencies or maybe weaknesses in risk management or governance around the IMM. These increases are applied in multiples of half a decimal point, so for example from 1.4 up to 1.45 or 1.5. It acts as a direct supervisory tool, really, to encourage banks to fix identified shortcomings in their IMM framework.
Okay. And are there risks not in EPE, similar to the market risk concept of RNMA?
Yes, absolutely. There are risks not in effective expected positive exposure, or RAMP, a bit of a mouthful. Institutions should strive to identify and monitor these regularly. They often get uncovered through processes like the initial and ongoing internal validation, through back testing, controls of input data integrity, stress testing, the usual suspects. And similar to RNME and market risk, RNAIP add-ons need to be quantified and updated at least quarterly. Again, it ensures a more accurate and comprehensive capital calculation. It's the same core principle. If your main model isn't capturing everything, you need a transparent, quantifiable way to add that missing risk back in.
So after covering all that ground, what does this all mean for you risk managers navigating these complex regulatory landscapes in your daily work? What's the big picture takeaway?
Well, I think this deep dive really underscores that managing operational risks and regulatory compliance in banking today, it goes far beyond just mere tick box exercises. It genuinely demands a holistic, well-governed framework. It demands meticulous data quality, robust internal controls, and frankly, a deep understanding of these intricate modeling techniques, including, increasingly, the evolving role of machine learning, the consistent emphasis on independence and validation, those granular requirements for backtesting and data quality, and the explicit recognition of risks not in the model, both RMA and RMB. All of this highlights a clear supervisory drive towards ever greater model integrity and truly comprehensive risk capture. It's really about ensuring models are not just compliant on paper, but genuinely fit for purpose in understanding and managing risk effectively.
Yeah, it's clear that continuous vigilance and adaptation are absolutely key. This isn't a static field where you can just set it up and forget about it.
Exactly right. The dynamic nature of the guide itself, constantly reflecting regulatory changes, industry feedback means that staying well-informed, staying agile, it's just an ongoing process. It's ultimately about ensuring your models don't just produce numbers, but that they truly reflect the underlying risks and enable sound, informed decision-making right across the entire institution.
So for you, our listener, here's a final provocative thought to perhaps mull over. Given the increasing sophistication of these internal models and this explicit regulatory acknowledgement of risks not in the model, how might future regulatory guides evolve? How can they strike that delicate balance between providing clear prescriptive requirements and allowing the crucial flexibility needed to adapt to new unforeseen risks and genuinely innovative modeling techniques as they emerge? Something to think about.